Hello, everybody. Welcome to the 13th episode of the Manor Podcast. I'm your co-host, Roger Bodee, joined as always with my best friend and other co-host, Michael Hamilton. Michael Hamilton, what's the sitch?
What's the sitch? Oh, we're leaving for Lille in less than a week, so I guess we're getting ready for Lille. What does that mean?
Like, what's the situation?
Yeah, we're recording the start of our podcast. Going to be recording the middle and the ending of it also. And then, yeah.
Well, you can never be recording the middle or the ending of anything. You can only be recording the part that you're recording.
What? Yeah, which sometimes that's the middle, sometimes that's the end.
You never watched Kim Possible?
No. If I did, it's been a really long time.
There you go. Okay. I went old school on that one. I'm okay. Get ready for France as well. I think I've solved the draft format, so that's good. I don't think I could ever lose another game of Limited again.
That's good.
Yeah, it's easy. You just force Icelander every time, and nobody sees it coming.
So what are we talking about today?
Good way to pivot the conversation, because today we're going to be talking about the notorious concept of pivot turns. So essentially, there's a very common idea of Flesh and Blood where at some point you'll need to take a pivot away from what your strategy that you've been doing to a certain point or what your game plan has been up to the point, whether that be primarily blocking or primarily attacking, in order to try to swing the momentum back in your favor or keep the momentum in your favor going. And Michael does not believe in them. He thinks they're much like Bigfoot.
I would like to, I guess, ask what exactly is involved in a pivot turn. Why would you want to shift your strategy from a game? Shouldn't you just be doing what's the best thing to be doing the entire game?
So there are going to be moments and opportunities in a game where you're going to give up short-term value or tempo, I guess we can come back to that term of dividing tempo at some point as well, in order to get better long-term initiative or value. And it's not always clear whether or not what your action or game plan will pay off in the long run. So in my mind, the core example of a pivot turn is anytime Prism is face tanking like 20 damage in order to set up auras, she's attempting to try to pivot the game into a situation where she's giving up a lot of life in this early state, usually early to mid-game board state, in order to get future payoff value from any resources gained or life saved from these auras that are going to eventually just stick around and potentially try to take over the game. So I think that, in my mind, is the clearest distillation of what the fundamental pivot turn is in Flesh and Blood.
So I guess the example is you're playing Prism. You're taking a lot of damage to develop your auras. At some point, you can't keep taking this damage, so you start blocking more and only retaining like one card to continue swinging the auras, and that's what you would classify as a pivot turn, when you stop just taking all the damage to develop the auras.
That's an example of a pivot turn, yes.
Okay, that makes sense, because you are changing your game plan, but it's all just part of one game plan going into the game, right? You're sacrificing health to set up these auras, and then when it is no longer feasible to do so, you stop sacrificing health to set up more auras. But like throughout the course of the game, are you not blocking on hands that don't do a good job at developing auras?
Well, that depends. You can also be attempting to swing with the giant heralds in order to develop a game plan that way. So there's kind of this fluid dynamic in Prism. And I guess stepping away from Prism in general, if we just look at it more of a macro level, there's going to be, I guess, let's circle back to the term tempo. Do you think that there's any tempo in Flesh and Blood?
I really don't like the word tempo, because in my opinion, there isn't really, like, sometimes you're advantaged, sometimes you're disadvantaged, but like, tempo is whoever's losing more health on a certain turn doesn't necessarily have less tempo, or whoever's dealing more damage on a turn doesn't necessarily have tempo. What would you define tempo as? I guess,
yeah, so you're on the back foot where you are behind in life or resources, and let's say, for example, I'm at 10 life and you're at 10 life, but you get to swing 4 3-powered attacks every turn at me. So I'm obligated to start blocking first. So I am immediately on the back foot because I don't have the opportunity to take the damage in order to present damage back to you. So from there, it's up to me to try to find a creative way or hope that you stumble in order to steal the initiative back so that you have to start being the one to block you with your cards in your hand.
Okay. So if we're playing a 5 mirror in limited. And you go first. You attack me with some things. I block with most of my cards. Then I attack with most of my things. Maybe you block with one. Maybe you don't block at all. You go to like 8 to 10 life.
Yeah, you have tempo at that point.
And I'm still at 18 or something. Then I have tempo because I'm just winning the game. Whoever's ahead in the game is who has tempo.
Usually, yeah, that's like, well, yeah, because if all things continue equally, if nothing else changes about the game state, the favored person is going to continue their advancing position in order to win the game from there. Yeah. So it's up to you to try to deviate from what your normal turn cycle would look like or what you're obligated to do in order to find a way to get them to start blocking in order to alleviate the amount of damage that's being presented to you every turn.
So I guess I hear your example that tempo is like happening when you are threatening lethal on your opponent because they are forced to block, because if they don't, they will die. What are other ways tempo is generated or exists in the game?
So you've never had a game state where your opponent is ahead on life and...
I guess for clarity, I'm not trying to say that these things don't exist. I just don't think there is a solid universal definition of them. So I want to understand where you are coming from and make sure that that's like clearly communicated.
So I guess everybody knows that heroes have typical damage output turns where you know that on average a rune blade is going to be capable of presenting at least 15 damage a turn all the way up to like 30 to 35 damage. So there's that range of damage that is, I would say, the average rune blade amount of damage. And that deviates from hero to hero and circumstance to circumstance, depending on what part of the game you're in, whether or not you're on second cycle and they're all on blues. But there's like an expected amount of damage you can expect to be taking, regardless of whether or not you block or don't block. And once that becomes untenable for you to either mitigate that damage or commit all of your resources to never do anything threatening to your opponent again, that's obviously a losing game state. And that's what you're either trying to set up on your own end or avoid from your opponent's end. And there's different ways in which heroes go about obtaining that game state, right? Because ultimately, a fundamental mechanic to the game is pretty central to tempo, where your cards are both offensive and defensive resources, unless you're playing a bunch of ball lightnings. But normally they're supposed to be offensive and defensive resources. So that just inherently leads to the tension between whether or not you're using your cards to attack or defend.
Yeah, that makes sense. So you're trying to put the game state into a spot where your opponent is required to block with their cards because you will be presenting lethal, and that is having tempo. When you are presenting lethal and forcing them to block with their cards rather than attack you back with their cards. Or, I guess, regardless of what is the most efficient use of their cards, you're forcing them to block with them.
Yeah. And a pivot would be going from a situation where you have been on the back foot trying to block out or stay away from that lethal range where you no longer have any options with your cards to even decide to whether even to think about just attacking the other hero again. Because once you get to a certain life total, like the 1 to 2 life total range, it's incredibly hard to have a pivot turn because you just don't have any options in order to swing the tempo back. So that's why it's usually incumbent on the player on the back foot to create the situations where they're going to either do something disruptive or overwhelm the amount of damage that they might take in the short term in order to seal back that initiative. So that's like what a pivot would be. They're pivoting from being on the back foot to the front foot.
What is being on the back foot in the first place? Just being at a lower life total?
Generally, yeah. But not necessarily at the same time either, because you could be at 20 versus a rune blade that's at 15, and that's still, or 10 even, that's still maybe even parity at that point, because if your deck is only capable of presenting like 10 damage a turn at most, and as we said before, rune blades can produce up to like 35 damage on their crazy turns, it's not 100% clear who's on the front foot or back foot at that point.
Yeah, I guess what I'm not really sure I agree with or understand is what you really mean by being on the front foot or back foot. If you are in a range where you are being threatened with lethal, it sounds like you don't have tempo because they can threaten you with lethal, so you can't preserve your hand. But before that, let's say at the start of the game, what causes someone to be on the front foot if they're just like not blocking and attacking? Are they on the front foot, even if they're just like taking your hits back in order to keep attacking? Because if you look back at a lot of aggro mirrors, a lot of the time, both players don't block very often because their cards are much more efficient attacking than blocking. So they prefer to just attack with all their cards most of the time.
Yeah, absolutely. But that's why also they prefer to go second in the aggro mirrors, because you get to use the initiative to prevent the damage with your cards for free, quote unquote, that turn, where your opponent won't have that luxury for the rest of the game. So you're implicitly saying, I am going to allow you the first mover advantage of the game because I want to be able to have the front foot, tempo, initiative, whatever colorful word you want to use for this, where I am going to be able to present more damage than our hands are going to be able to block for, and you are not going to have a good opportunity in order to mitigate my damage for the rest of the game.
Okay, so do pivot turns exist in aggro mirrors? So if I'm going first and we're playing a 5 mirror and I attack you, and let's say you drew a Phoenix Flame or something and you leak 5 damage and I Arsenal, and then you attack me back and you do 15 damage to me, and then I attack you back and I threaten 14 damage. Is there like what is, I guess I'm not really sure what's the pivot turn, or what would be happening. That would be a tempo or pivot turn. And then like when you get to low life totals, you're forced to block, but you're never forced to block before that, basically, unless they have on hits.
Right. As long as you aren't taking lethal damage, you are not obligated to block. And technically, you're not even obligated to block once you're being threatened with lethal damage. You could just take it and lose the game.
Sure.
A pivot turn would then be threatening an Arsenal card, where if their cards scale exponentially off the 5th card and you are playing a Command and Conquer, you are then trying to steal back initiative, where maybe you are blocking less on a turn. You're taking more damage up front in order to make it so that they are dealing less damage on their next turn cycle, so that you can start presenting the higher damage threshold for the rest of the game. Additionally, trying to bait out or force your opponents to use pieces of equipment that block early is a huge tempo swing, because that's options that they're not going to have available to them at the end of the game once they're on low life totals, and they're then required to use their limited cards in their hand every turn in order to be defensive. And that's why one of the biggest mistakes people make in Flesh and Blood often, especially early on, is saying, well, I can block with my armor early because I'm going to have this really sweet middle game turn. And well, you might have good value in the earlier mid game from your equipment. You're not that exercising that option earlier on is not worth as much as having that option later on once your options become more constrained by your life total being lower. Do you agree or disagree with that?
So it is definitely expensive to block with the armor. I don't see how it's a tempo hit, because you spend your armor, but you're saving those 6 points of life or whatever that you saved by blocking with your armor.
Is every point of life created equally?
Yes. No.
No. No.
Why not?
Because your last 3 life total points are worth exponentially more than your first 3 life total points. Because once you have 0 life total points, you lose the game. Did you know that? I know you don't lose very often, Michael, but you generally, when you run out of life total points, us mortals, we lose the game at that point.
I've lost many games of Flesh and Blood, so...
I don't believe it. I'll believe it when I see it.
So, in Flesh and Blood, in many matchups, I think all life points are essentially equal. If you aren't...
How egalitarian of you.
If you're not doing anything to build an advantage over time or have any effects that like scale over the course of the game, it doesn't really matter whether it's your first life point or your last life point. It's all essentially the same value of a card. Or maybe I should say a second to last life point. Your last life point is kind of special, because when you lose that, you lose. But it's like, so you have to defend it more aggressively than you would any other life point. Like Kadachi for 1 becomes a must block. Phoenix Flame for 1 becomes a must block. But a lot of the time you end up in that situation because potentially you didn't value your other life points as highly as you should, or the game was just like disadvantaged from the start. But in situations where your opponent can keep threatening 1 damage when you're at 1 life, a lot of times that game is just lost anyway.
So at that point, the difference between your first 3 life points and then your range of life points between 1 and 5 or 1 and 2 or 1 and 3 are a lot different. Because if you're saying there's a huge difference between the 1 1 and 0. Obviously, that's the point of the game where you've lost. But then in your own statement there, you just said sometimes you're at 1 life total point and they're going to keep threatening 1. So then you've lost the game earlier anyways. So that means you lost the game at the point that you hit the range where you can no longer keep out of their damage output range. Does that make sense? Or am I misunderstanding something? Because that means you could effectively lose the game at 10 life because you no longer have any opportunities to not block with your whole hand because they threaten 10 damage every single turn. So at that point, them threatening 1 damage and then threatening 10 damage is the exact same number.
No, because 1 damage is easier to block than 10 damage. So
sure, but you still only have a certain amount of damage mitigation per hand.
So like that last life point is the most important, I guess, because when you lose it, you lose. But if you're losing when you reach that 1 life point, that 1 life point is kind of useless, right? You just lost anyway.
Right. And it's the same as if you're in that 10 life point range, it's useless. Those 10 life total points are useless because you've lost anyways. There's nothing you can do for the rest of the game to ever hope to threaten to deal damage back to your opponent to win. If I'm at 1 and you're at 10 and I'm threatening 20 damage a turn or 13 damage a turn and your deck is nothing but block 3s, I've won the game.
Why is that the case?
I guess cards in deck, but...
No, if I'm at 10 life and I have all block 3s and you always present 13 damage, can I just block with 2 cards, take 7, and then attack with 2 cards?
Yeah, I did the math wrong in my example.
If I'm at 10 and all my deck is block 3s and you present 22 damage every turn, then I lose the game.
Yeah. Or 4 and everything is 4 damage and you have block 3s. It's just weird to me that you never thought about the game this way. Like, this is something I think about a lot, like, in the early to mid game. And it's something that I would figure have to be very important to a player like you in Guardian, because you are looking to usually take larger chunks of damage at times. Or maybe this is why I suck at Guardian, because I would try to do the Guardian trap of take the damage to put the disruption back in order to steal the longer term initiative, where playing the channel like Frigid or Spinal Crushing or Crippling Crushing or Oaken Holding, where most of the time it was the correct answer was actually just block.
Yeah, so a lot of the time, if you do this, you try to take damage to have a quote-unquote pivot turn where you attack for a big disruptive effect. Sure, then you have a big disruptive effect, and then you stop them from doing what they want. And then a lot of the time when you're playing your Guardian decks, you do that, and then you draw a hand of 4 blues or 3 blues and a red attack that costs 3 or 5, and you can't efficiently use the rest of your hand to present more damage or present more effects. And maybe this is why I'm kind of opposed to the idea of pivot turns, is if you take a bunch of damage to do something powerful, even if that completely stops them from doing anything on their next turn, they take some damage back and they don't present any damage to you the following turn. Well, now you have a 4-card hand, sometimes a 5-card hand, and you need to convert that hand into attacking again. And if you can't effectively do that, you quote unquote pivoted, but then you just give up whatever advantages you may have gained from that pivot, where they just attack you again after that.
So what's the difference between, I guess, the Oldheim limp pivots to the rock hard prism pivots, where her auras and her short-term loss of value is able to make up for that in the long run? Is it just that the auras are just that insanely better rate in the longer term value than attacking for 9 and not allowing your opponent to play the game for a turn?
As Prism, a lot of the time you're taking damage to set up your auras in the early game, and then you're expecting these auras to generate value over the course of the game as long as they survive. And ideally you're putting out 2 auras in the same turn a couple times, and that is basically guaranteeing that some of them survive. And then you try to rely on those auras to push through damage in the end of the game. And the main reason you would stop playing auras as the game gets later is because the amount of time left in the game isn't enough to get enough value out of the aura for playing it, right?
Or you just die because your auras don't block.
Yeah, but you stop. You're like, either I'm going to die before this aura matters, or they're going to die before this aura is efficient enough to be worth having played it over, let's say, a Herald, or pitching it for resources.
Or sometimes your life total makes the decision for you, where you since the auras mostly cost 4, you can say, well, if I use 2 yellows out of my hand in order to play this aura, that means I have 1 card left to block with. And if I'm at 4 life total points and they're attacking me for 4 twice, I just can't make that play, or I lose on the spot. So I'm obligated at that point to find a different use for that aura. It's not a question of not getting enough value out of it. It's the fact that I can't even make the decision to even attempt to try to get value out of it in the first place. Maybe thinking about it from like a different analogy might help this click for you a little bit better. So like if we think about it like in a more traditional game like chess or Go, like computers that are able to do the perfect information projection out of 10,000 moves or whatever are able to evaluate whose position is better in a given situation, right? They're usually saying, well, Black is better on this chessboard because they have a more active bishop and they're taking up more space in the center. Or in Go, White is better because they have more flexible territories and have created more secured groups than Black has in this game. So let's say there was a computer that was able to perfectly calculate every possible permutation of cards between 2 players and their sequence of plays. Do you think there would be no such way to evaluate a favored position in a card game?
There definitely would be. That'd be based on card scene, cards left in deck, pitch stack order, cards and life total, and whatever you have in play and equipment and stuff. So tempo is just being in a winning position.
Or trying to create a winning position in the longer run by giving up short-term value. It's like a gambit in chess. Or a throw-in Go.
So would you call that creating tempo in, I guess, let's use your Go example. When you throw in a piece in Go and they capture it, but in doing so, it means that group of stones is going to die in the long term?
It depends. And there is a term for tempo in Go. It's called sente, and you always want to be playing in sente, or your opponent owing you a move in a particular situation. It's a very real concept in the game. Yes, it can absolutely be the case, where if your opponent has to respond to your move in a given situation because your move is so threatening, that allows you the next move after your opponent responds to your move to play wherever else you want on the board. It's called maintaining sente. Don't try to knock me on my Go knowledge, Michael. I was a 9-digit Q for a while.
9 digits. That's a lot of digits.
Yeah, 9 more digits and 5 more Don levels, and I would have been pro. But it's like I think I was like the equivalent to like a 13 or 1400 in like chess elo or something like that at like my peak Go. But like I haven't played in 5 years. But
I guess jumping back to Flesh and Blood.
We're not starting a Go podcast.
Unfortunately, not.
Dang.
I think Go is a cool game. I appreciate having some variance in my games to make it a little bit less memorization based than pattern recognition. But jumping back to Flesh and Blood, anytime you are in an advantageous position, you have tempo. A long-term advantageous position where you're... No. Okay.
Anytime you have short-term advantage, you have tempo.
So if I take 5 damage to play out my aura, then my opponent has tempo.
Generally.
Okay, let's jump back to Guardians. I like Guardians. So let's say I'm playing against a Runeblade, as we frequently do, and they attack me with some cards, and I block with 3 cards, and then I pitch an ice card to swing Winter's Wail. What would determine who has tempo in that position, where the Runeblade's attacking with their whole hand, and I'm blocking with 3 cards and attacking with 1 card? Does that mean they have tempo? Is it just based on life totals? What defines tempo in that kind of game?
It would definitely depend on life totals, but life totals always have to be considered when evaluating pivoting and tempo and initiative in the game, and any other synonyms you want to use for tempo. And it would depend also then on deck cards, number of cards in deck, where if they're on their last 5 cards in deck and you still have 20 cards in deck, then you still have all the tempo, because you're creating here's a 5D chess term for all of our listeners now: negative tempo. You have negative tempo, Michael, because your defensive capabilities are so overwhelming that your opponent can't ever generate enough offensive tempo in order to overcome your negative tempo.
So you can have tempo by threatening to fatigue someone.
Right. That's negative tempo. And when you combine negative tempo and regular tempo, you get game state equilibrium.
I feel like we've got 40 minutes of recording, and I don't feel like this is any clearer than it was when we started. I think I get the Prism example where you are playing Prism, you're taking this damage to develop your auras. I don't know where tempo comes into it, but that's definitely things you do with Prism. You're like, I'm taking my damage, playing my auras, classic Prism.
It can't block
They
anyways.
they don't block anyways.
The decision's made for me. I hope tempo exists, otherwise Prism doesn't exist.
I guess I'm just confused on the base definition of tempo still.
So let's take it back even to the could you understand like what initiative in the game? Like, do you think you could evaluate like who is winning, who has the current winning game state?
The current winning game state?
Yes. Do you think so? Like your Oldheim, you have 50 cards in your deck, and you're against a Briar who has 2 cards left in their deck,
and I got like at least 8 life points or something. Okay.
And you got 20 health. Yeah, you got 20 life. Who's winning that game state?
The Oldheim.
Why?
Because the Briar can't kill him, and he's out of threats.
Right.
Or she's out of threats.
Yeah, that's the surface level like evaluation you can do of like who has the initiative, who's winning in a game state. So let's wind the clock back, and let's say you're at that same 20 life total points. Briar's at 20 life total points. You have 20 cards in deck. Briar has 15 cards left in deck. You will do what all good Flesh and Blood players say, and you'll say, "Can I see your graveyard?" And you will look through their graveyard and try to remember the cards they pitched earlier in the game to remember what kind of threats they have left. And you'll say, well, I know that Briar pitched a Channel Mount Heroic with another Earth card earlier on in the game, and they've already played 2 other Channel Mount Heroics, and those are the most threatening cards that I'm worried about in this matchup right now. So all I have to do is get through this 1 Channel Mount Heroic, and I will have created a winning game state. So you are in the lead in this game state, I would say, because the only card that matters in this very simplified example that we're saying at this moment is this Channel Mount Heroic that's threatening to overwhelm you with the point of damage, overwhelm your hand's damage mitigation, and cause you to lose the game. And then, so from that standpoint, the Briar then has to be thinking, well, I know I'm trying to play to the Channel Mount Heroic in order to mitigate, or in order to set up a winning game state. So both players are on the same, like, knowing what's up, and they say, hey, can I look through your graveyard? And they say, wow, you've only played, all your Sync Belows are gone, but oh no, you've only attacked with 1 Oakenold this game. And I know that you were coming up on second cycle where you did that perfect Michael Hamilton pitch stack of the Oakenolds. So this game plan of the Channel Mount Heroic setup might not even be good enough if they get it, because they will have already lost enough initiative or cards in deck or life at that point where the game state's basically deterministic. So it's up to them to create a pivot where they're trying to do something else in order to close out the game or win the game. And it's really hard for decks to do that sometimes. And it's not easy. And we see that a lot in Flesh and Blood, especially if we're looking at Uprising, everybody's favorite limited format, where people just are like, oh, well, I lost the die roll, I can't win the 5 match, because there's no way for you to generate tempo in order to steal the initiative back in the game, because there's no point at which you can threaten anything or present damage over the amount that Fi is going to have inherently capable of his 4 to 5 card hands.
Sorry, we jump between analogies. Jumping back.
Yeah, that was my bad.
If the Oldheim is able to survive this Channel Mount Heroic, he wins the game, or survive at a reasonably healthy life total or whatever. So does Oldheim have tempo in this example? Because if the computer runs the simulation, that the Oldheim is going to win the game most of the time.
Right. So it's incumbent on the Briar in order to find a pivot where doing something unexpected, maybe the Briar starts blocking out with her hands in some unusual ways, or tries to find in a different way to start chipping in damage, or just starts activating Grasp of the Arknight every turn to start building up Rune Chance to start trying to get arcane damage. There's just things you have to do in order to go around the positive tempo or around the negative tempo that your opponent's setting up in order to exact the winning game state that you want to create. And sometimes that just happens because somebody blunders, Sometimes somebody just says, oh, I don't need to attack that Genesis. They can make 1 Spectral Shield. What's the worst that can happen? And then the game just snowballs for there where, Prism puts out 2 more auras in a turn, and you're just like, oh, well, I just never had an opportunity to generate forward tempo again. And I just got outvalued from there. So maybe you are actually behind on tempo until your opponent blundered, and then you were way ahead. So there's just a lot of things that can factor into this at that point.
If we jump again, I got another question. If we sit down and we see one person's playing Oldhim, one person's playing Prism, does the Prism player have the tempo because they're likely to win before anything starts?
Yeah, because there's almost nothing that Oldhim can do to pivot to change the game state. Like there is nothing that he can do to steal back the tempo in the matchup.
So tempo is literally just whoever's more likely to win or favored to win from there.
Right. But that can change through pivots.
And so a pivot turn is taking the tempo from your opponent. And taking the tempo is when you go from a losing game state to a winning game state, either through a genius play or a mistake from your opponent. So a pivot turn is
executing that mistake or genius play.
Or lucky draw or whatever it may be, I guess.
Sure, yeah. Or, drawing the perfect rainbow Ogan Old after.
Yeah, in the finals of Indianapolis. Yeah. Heard it all before.
Are you a believer? Have I convinced you?
So a pivot turn is just any time the game state goes from losing to winning is a pivot turn.
That's what you're trying to set up with a pivot turn.
Okay. So sometimes you're just playing the game and your opponent draws a dysfunctional hand of all blues or all reds or whatever it may be.
And that's a negative pivot turn, so they can't do anything. They'd lose all the initiative. And that's what you're hoping for. Like, that's what you're hoping for against the Rune Blades. You're just hoping, like, draw the all non-attack action hand, please.
Or classic.
Player Sonata, the very good playable card that everybody loves and is definitely everybody should keep playing for as long as it's legal. Rune Blades, please keep playing that card because you always, it's such good tempo when you get the 2 cards when you put resources into it. It's very good. It's a very good tempo initiative, and nobody has ever whiffed off of a Sonata Arcanix and lost because of that ever in the history of Flesh and Blood.
Now that we've established what a pivot turn is and tempo is tempo plural? What tempo is? Okay, we know what pivot turns are. We know what tempo is. How do you create a pivot turn then? It's just when you're like. So it happens when you draw really well, your opponent draws really poorly, or someone makes a mistake. Is that correct?
Or your opponent is unable to deal with the game state that you've created as a result of your pivot turn. Like, best example is, I know we keep going back to it, is Prism Auras, because she's just the clearest example I could go to. There's probably other ways to do it. I know there are, in fact. Usually Icelander is another good example where she'll lose a bunch of initiative sometimes in order to set up Frost Hex or Kano playing these potions or something like that. Anytime that you're trying to set up and either lose even more initiative in the game in order to get such an overwhelming advantage later, or do something that will overwhelm your opponent's resources so much that they'll have fewer options left to them available for either the next couple of turn cycles, or hopefully the rest of the game, ideally, if you're pivoting hard enough.
Okay.
That's why like Command & Conquer is like a mini pivot. Command & Conquer is like a small, small little pivot. Because you're just trying to say, hey, I'm trying to take away a resource from you. I'm going to take more damage up front, and so I can try to strip you of a resource later, and then I want the forward initiative from there because I denied you a resource, so my resources will be more impactful by the fact that you had less. That's the smallest, tiniest little pivot you can think of. I guess Erase Phase also is similar, where your cards are less impactful because you don't have a hero ability or talent or classes or anything like that. I guess hero abilities stick around, but you don't have talent or class cards next turn, so your strategy is going to flounder on top of this damage that I'm pushing. And because you're floundering a little bit, I'm going to be able to flourish.
So is this what everyone means when they use the terms tempo and pivot turns? They're just talking about swinging the game from a losing game state.
I can't speak for everyone. I'm not going to take full responsibility for every human being who uses these words on the planet, but that's what I mean.
Okay, cool.
Because for all I know, somebody's going to walk up to me at a calling now and be like, oh man, I had tempo because I shuffled my deck wrong. It's like, what?
I feel like tempo and pivot turns have always been like buzzwords, and I've never really had a strong grasp on what is generally meant when people say these words.
So here's another way to think about tempo. So I guess if we think about it from its original sense with music, which is like the pace of which the game is played, and if we relate it to card games, then a better way to think about it then would be to say the pace at which threats are deployed. If you are deploying more threats than your opponent, you're going to have tempo. And so that's why we say decks like Runeblade play the game a little bit faster than decks that are slower like Guardian. And then we have to get into the sense of what even is a threat, right? But so far, are you with me on the first concept there?
So tempo is not it's not just who is winning, it is who is playing more threats.
Well, if you're winning, your cards are more threatening, right? So this example we've been talking about this whole time, if you're at 3 life and your opponent attacks you with a 3-powered attack, that's very, very threatening because you'll literally lose the game if you don't block.
Sure. Okay. I guess we can go into what a threat is then.
So, yeah, and that's why a card like CNC is threatening to steal back tempo, because otherwise, if you're ahead on life, your opponent could just soak up all the damage because nothing you're doing to them is actually threatening them. If your opponent's at 40 life and you attack them for 30, you're not threatening them at all, technically, because nothing you're doing is mattering if you're going to lose the next turn cycle, or they know they have a stronger turn cycle that you're not going to be able to defend out and lose the game. So that's why also, once again, I've been saying, there's a difference between that range of life you get to between 1 and 10, 1 to 20, those life total ranges matter a lot for tempo, because at certain life total ranges, certain cards and effects become more threatening than others than they would be at other points in the game.
Okay, so I guess let's jump into an example. So thinking back to, like, let's say a Phi deck where you're attacking, but basically you don't have any on hits. You're just attacking for damage, and your damage becomes really threatening when they're at a low life total and the damage is threatening lethal because you die if you don't block. But before that, if your cards are more efficient on offense, you don't have any real motivation to block if you're not being threatened with lethal.
Well, it depends at that point too, because once again factors into, well, you're a Guardian and you're saying, well, if I don't block, then I get to I have 4 cards in my hand, they all block 3, so I have 12 total block value. But if I attack and I can use all my cards, I can swing back for 15. So therefore, it is higher value on just the raw numbers for me to attack with this hand, right? But then you take the 30 damage to attack back for 15, but then if Phi swings back 30 damage again, you no longer have the option to attack for the rest of the game, more than likely, because you're just hard committed to blocking and won't be able to use your cards effectively for the rest of the game. So that's why it's matchup dependent, it's situation dependent, and I can kind of see why you would struggle with this concept a little bit, because overall, yes, winning turn cycles does factor in a lot to tempo, but you also have to consider what the overall game plans for both decks are and what the velocity of threats that each deck is presenting on each turn cycle. And that's also what allows auras to be so impactful in a game, because while the turn cycle you set up the aura, maybe you'll take more damage, hopefully. You usually don't want to be taking extra on hits, letting your opponent draw cards, because it's harder to recoup that value than just taking the damage. But every time your opponent swings anything into a Spectra aura, they are losing value. They are not getting go again, they're not getting any on hits, and they're not getting any damage through. They're just spending either a whole action, sometimes even a whole card, attacking the aura, which is a complete loss of tempo for them at that point. They are taking a whole card that is normally can be or would be very threatening, sometimes even a lethal attack, or they could threaten a lethal attack, and it's still right to swing into an aura, just because the amount of threat or tempo that that aura will gain back in the long run will completely offset that attack.
So it's correct to attack the aura sometimes, even when the attack is lethal. Why is that minus tempo when the aura?
Because you're not threatening. If we're saying tempo now is the rate of threat deployment, then you're not deploying. Then you're deploying an answer, not a threat.
Sure. So you're instead of building your own tempo, you're taking away your opponent's tempo, because that aura represents tempo in play.
Yeah, negative tempo.
It is a threat.
And that's why Guardians generate negative tempo, because they're not usually threatening very much. Most of the time, a Guardian at its core is threatening one attack with one on-hit effect. So if the opponent can mitigate that one attack or that one on-hit effect, that is just not a lot of tempo gain. So therefore, that's why Guardians have to generate the negative tempo and spending more cards and resources in order to block and play more defensive games, because the rate at which they can deploy threats is so much lower than every other class in the game, aside from Azalea, which has 0 tempo and 0 answers. So
then if I'm playing, let's say I'm playing Bravo.
Yeah.
I got 2 blues, Crippling Crush, and a Seismic Surge token. And instead of blocking with those, I play this Crippling Crush. This is not generating tempo. This is removing my opponent's tempo because it's either they're going to have to block and lose threats or they're going to discard 2 threats.
That is generating tempo. What are you talking about? Because you are presenting a threat while simultaneously removing your opponent's threats. So I guess if we think of like tempo, because you're winning that exchange for tempo because your 1 threat is going to be taking away your opponent's 3 threats here, potentially. The card they're blocking with, and if they can't block with anything else, they have to discard 2 cards. You're using a very threatening card to make it so your opponent can't threaten you back their next turn cycle in a meaningful way, and then you get to present the next, hopefully, meaningful threat. And that's why, like, what is a threat is overall fluid and dynamic in game states, and why sometimes you'll say, like, I think playing this Channel Lake Frigid is generating a lot of tempo for me because my opponents won't be able to threaten me in a meaningful way in their next turn. And then your opponent just has 2 extra, like an extra blue in their hand and still is able to present 3 or 4 sometimes threats back to you. And you're saying, well, I spent a whole card in order to try to generate tempo in hopes that my opponent wouldn't be threatening me back in a meaningful way in their next turn cycle. And here they are threatening me back in a meaningful way in their next turn cycle. So I've double lost tempo. I did not deploy a threat, and I did not stop my opponent from threatening me.
So gaining tempo and taking away your opponent's tempo, they're the same thing. Is that right? Because you said you're trying to play the Channel Lake Frigid to gain tempo, but it's not presenting any threats. It's not doing anything threatening. It just stops your opponent from threatening you or weakens your opponent's ability to threaten you. So it should be taking away their tempo, right?
Yeah, so because you can't maintain equal tempo for the whole game state because somebody will just run out of life points. If all we're doing is just attacking each other and presenting the most threats we can every turn, that's just not a very interesting game. Do you think you get it now? Do we finally crystallize and distill the meaning of tempo?
This does feel kind of different from what you were saying earlier. I'm not sure if it's just like another angle or it's completely contradictory.
Yeah, I had to recontextualize it. And I might be contradictory, but that's because I had to explore and help. And even just talking through it with you helped me better understand it myself. So thank you, Michael. That's why there's no such thing as a stupid question, like, what is tempo?
Okay, so to wrap it all up, to sum everything up, what is tempo?
The rate at which each opponent is presenting threats or answers.
So if one player is presenting many threats and another player is not presenting very many threats, they're just blocking out or not doing very much, then the person that is presenting all these threats has the tempo or has a tempo advantage. And then a pivot turn is when someone kind of ignores or mitigates these threats a way that they can then present their own threats back at the original player that, quote, had the tempo. So a pivot turn would be the Crippling Crush example, where you are presenting a large threat and your opponent now is not going to be able to keep presenting threats the way they were. And that is a pivot turn that's taking the tempo. Cool. I think that sums it up pretty nicely.
Very cool. Any other questions that you have about pivoting or tempo or initiative in games now? Hopefully you can use these tips, Michael, in your next game of Flesh and Blood to help you win a little bit more.
Hopefully. Though they were concepts that I feel like this is more like a definition talk rather than helpful strategy advice.
That's not true. I think the fact that you, a very high-level former #1 constructive player in the world, was unsure of what these buzzwords were and what their ethereal nature was, I think outlining them, having a good debate on them, and establishing them, it will be very helpful for a lot of people, hopefully. Otherwise, we just made a bad podcast.
I hope so.
So are you a believer? Do you believe now?
I don't know what there is to believe in. I feel like I've just been like, yeah, sometimes you're losing and then you're winning.
That's what I was saying from the beginning. That's why you can't not believe in this because they're just established inherent things about the game. But you're like, I don't believe in it. So I would tell you what 2 + 2 equals and show you how to get to 4.
I guess I am a believer then. Sometimes you're losing and then you're winning after your turn, and that is a pivot turn. Or sometimes you're losing and then your opponent has a really bad turn and it's a negative pivot turn.
Yeah, hell yeah, Michael, you did it. I'm proud of you. I love you. It's just like watching my own other son learn how to talk and walk right now. You're doing it too.
Thanks.
But more importantly, to the listener out there, let us know what you think of our definitions of pivot or tempo or initiative are in Flesh and Blood. Do you have any good examples that we might have overlooked or really think that we're getting something wrong with our definition? Obviously, if Michael Hamilton, the great Michael Hamilton, wasn't clear on this definition, the teeny tiny peon Roger Bodee could be very wrong here. So I'm definitely open to being educated more properly by somebody out there who can show me that 2 + 2 = 5 somehow.
Right.
So anything you want to say before we sign off then, Michael?
Thanks everybody for listening and being patient while I learned all about pivot turns.
Yeah, thank you very much for listening, everybody. And the next time you're creating your own pivot turn, always remember, mind your manners. We'll see you next time.